Did I scare you? Yeah, I thought not. So earlier this month, I read Dracula, and I made a video talking about that. And then I made a video talking about vampire stories, and particularly vampire novels. Thinking about vampires got me thinking about ghosts and zombies and mummies and other types of undead creatures. So today, in a special Halloween video, we're going to be talking about undead creatures in fiction. Now, I have to say that horror is not one of my preferred genres. I like fantasy, I like science fiction, I like historical fiction and classics, but you kind of have to be living under a rock to not be in some way aware of the multitude of vampire, zombie, and ghost stories that are out there. And I have read and watched my fair share of them. I mean, I was in high school when the Twilight movies came out, okay? But I do remember reading a zombie story once and just being very freaked out by it. And I didn't really have the words to explain why at the time, but I think I understand why now. Even though I was reading Twilight and I was reading other kind of knockoff vampire stories, some of which were, I would probably say, better, and I wasn't bothered at all by the concept of ghosts. This one zombie book, and I don't remember what it was now, like what the title was or anything, but it just freaked me out. I just couldn't handle it, didn't finish it. Vampires, while they are often kind of corrupted and evil, and ghosts, while they may be kind of spooky, usually have some memory of who they were and some amount of free will or intelligence. Whereas zombies are basically just walking corpses, and I think that just bothered me, and to be honest, it still does. And thinking about that got me thinking about how closely the concept of the undead is linked to the idea of the body versus the soul. Basically, my thinking is that the ghost is meant to be a soul without a body. It's just a disembodied spirit. It remembers who it was, but it isn't that person anymore. It's no longer in its body. And a zombie is like the polar opposite. A body without a soul. A walking corpse with nothing inside of it but still somehow alive, but not alive. And I think that you can put other forms of the undead somewhere along that continuum as well. So, for instance, vampires. They usually have some amount of intelligence, some memory of who they were. However, the question of whether the vampire has its human soul is a question that actually comes up a lot in stories about vampires. For instance, in Dracula, the Suitors and Dr. Van Helsing talk a lot about how if they're able to kill vampire Lucy, then human Lucy's soul will be set free. So it's implied that human Lucy is trapped in there somewhere, but she's not the one calling the shots. There's some twisted, corrupted, false version of her that's controlling the undead vampire body. So I would say that vampires are somewhere along that continuum of the ghost being a disembodied soul or spirit and the zombie being a walking corpse, but more along the lines of a human soul trapped inside of an undead body. I think it's also really interesting that when the undead do have a body, we're not talking about ghosts here, we're talking about, vampires, zombies, mummies, ghouls, and so on and so forth. Sometimes it decays naturally, but other times it's preserved in some way. Like, you often see pictures of zombies where they look like they're literally rotting, but vampires, on the other hand, usually they're unnaturally just like they were the moment that they died. They'll be, skin is cold and there's no pulse or whatever the case may be, but they'll be kind of like frozen in time. Now, there are certain types of undead creatures that appear just across fiction, across literature, but there are others that are very specific to a particular work. And I think it's really interesting the types of undead creatures in the Lord of the Rings series. So of course there I'm thinking of the Barrow Wight that attacks the hobbits as they're leaving the Shire, but then also the Nazgul, who are the men who were given the rings, the 9 rings that were given to humanity, who, even though they should have died a long time ago, continue to exist and now are like husks of their former selves doing Sauron's bidding. I think that that's a really interesting concept, a really interesting take on the undead. Thinking about all this also made me think of some research that I did when I was in college for a presentation on the depiction of the Black Plague in medieval artwork. I found these really cool paintings that were done in the Middle Ages that showed people of all walks of life dancing with skeletons, kind of implying it doesn't matter if you're the king, the pope, a knight, a peasant, we're all gonna die. And even though the skeletons in the Danse Macabre paintings aren't undead monsters in the way that vampires, zombies, or ghosts are, I think it's really interesting to kind of think about the skeletons represented death, and more specifically the Black Plague. And as I mentioned in my vampires video, vampires were often kind of symbolic of or associated with disease in the Middle Ages as well. So I wonder how much of our concept of the undead has to do with, first of all, the inevitability of death, but then also disease. With several kinds of undead creatures spreading their condition by biting the person, they kind of, in some ways, particularly vampires and zombies, are like a virus. Finally, I wanted to mention that while the concept of the undead is often associated with the horror genre and with stories that are meant to frighten people, they're not always malicious or scary. There are plenty of examples of ghosts that either are tragic figures held to this world by some unfinished business, or are watching over people that they loved, or like Casper the Friendly Ghost, who's just basically a cartoon for kids. I also thought of Clara Oswald from the ending of season 9 of Doctor Who. Now, Clara doesn't become a ghost or a vampire or anything along those lines, not any kind of typical undead creature that we know of. But she's dead, and yet she's not. She doesn't have a pulse, she doesn't breathe, she's frozen in a moment in time before her death, able to move around and do things, but fated to return to the moment of her death. I don't think it was meant to be creepy because it was portrayed as kind of a bittersweet ending. But I do think she's basically undead in a time travel kind of way. Come to think of it, there are actually a lot of basically undead characters in Doctor Who. So many different characters that should be dead but aren't, in ways that are either kind of heartwarming or kind of horrifying, or a little bit of both. And then, have you ever seen the Day of the Dead skeletons? Now, obviously, this is not my culture, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I look at them and, they're dressed in beautiful costumes, they're doing festive things. I don't get the feeling that they're meant to be scary. And then, of course, recent vampire stories like Twilight have portrayed vampires as sympathetic, kind of misunderstood, and whatnot. So while the concept of something that should be dead and isn't, or was dead but came back wrong, can be unsettling, it's not always meant to be a scary kind of concept. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please feel free to subscribe to my channel. I post once or twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and I talk about reading, writing, literary concepts, classic literature, college tips, study tips, and more.